Good morning, LinkedIn Live, and good morning for anybody watching on YouTube Live as well. Good morning, Vikki. How are you doing?
Good morning. I'm very good. It's really good to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, official welcome. Hasn't the weather been strange this week? I just have to start with, I went out for a walk this morning, absolutely pouring with rain. I almost did a little video to say this is the before and after. Me kind of like a drowned rat this morning out for my morning walk.
Do you know, I think when the sun came out, it's easy to get used to it, isn't it? And then it goes back to rain and it's like, hey, what's this rain?
Yeah, we're reminded of the country in which we live. But good morning to anybody that is joining us this morning. If you are watching this live, please do say good morning in the chat. If you're watching on the replay and you've got any questions as you're going through, drop them in. I'm sure either myself or Vikki will follow up. So this is going to be an interesting one: passion versus professionalism. Vikki, I'm going to read out your intro. Junior Beeman, good morning. Junior, I think you deserve some sort of a medal because you're always like the first one in. Good morning. Let's have a joyful June and happy Pride Month as well, Junior. Vikki, Junior Beeman was the Rainbow Network lead in NatWest, I want to say,
nice.
for this region, and he's now moving into becoming the global chair of the Multicultural Network for NatWest. So congratulations, Junior.
Very good work.
Absolutely. Amazing. And so, Vikki, I'm going to read out your introduction. And this is the third or fourth one, basically. So ChatGPT writes the introductions for me, for my guests. It's something I've started doing. And I've had really good feedback from the guests as well. So we'll see how that goes. Good morning, Nyambi. I hope I'm pronouncing that, Nyambi. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Good morning from East Yorkshire. God, we're well represented by the North because I think Junior is up north somewhere, maybe in like Sheffield, I want to say. I think Junior maybe is. So we're well represented. So Vikki, here's your introduction, courtesy of ChatGPT. I'm really pleased to be joined this morning by Vikki Leach. Vikki is the Senior Director of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at King, part of Microsoft Gaming. She has over 15 years experience leading inclusion and behavioural change programs across global organisations from fashion and gaming to tech and data. Vikki is also a certified professional coach, holds an MSc in behavioural change, and is the author of the FT Guide to Inclusion and Diversity, a book I still remember clearly from my time judging the Business Book Awards. Bearing in mind, this is ChatGPT writing this, right, for me.
Wow.
See, ChatGPT knows everything about me. Vikki is known for bringing together evidence, empathy and practical tools to help leaders build more inclusive cultures, and I'm really looking forward to digging into all of that with her today.
Oh wow, well done, ChatGPT.
It's brilliant. ChatGPT knows me so well. And good morning, Jill, as well. Good morning, Jill Wall. So so that was the introduction. So as ChatGPT rightly said, I first came across you and your work as part of the Business Book Awards with your fabulous book, the FT Guide to Inclusion and Diversity. Good morning, Safia. Safi said, good to have you talking to us today, Vikki. Thanks for hosting the show. And if anybody hasn't got Vikki's book, and I didn't say I was going to plug your book or anything, but I must say it's probably one of the most practical books that I've certainly come across in this space. And obviously, having judged this category for a couple of years for the Business Book Awards, I've seen quite a lot of books in this space. And they're not always very practical, as in you can literally just kind of pick them up and sort of apply them, whether you are a practitioner, or a leader. And that was one of the things that I really liked about the book. It's very practical. And I guess it just reflects on your years of your many years of experience working in this space. Before I get into the question, and I didn't say I was going to ask it, what inspired you to write the book?
Oh, wow. Do you know what? I really wanted to write the book for other people. I felt I had all this stuff in my brain, and we'll go into this later, but you know, this is a profession that is not easy. So if I can help others, empower others, upskill others, that's why it was a practical guide that anybody, like a practitioner, as you said, but also a leader, can pick up the book and read it. So it really is just to help the profession in this really volatile world that we're trying to do a great job in.
Yeah, absolutely. Which that probably leads us nicely into the first question, which is because I think one of the phrases that you've used is DEI being a tough gig, or this work being a tough gig. Why do you think this is, DEI and the work of diversity and inclusion is one of the toughest gigs? And what do people often underestimate about the role?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to stick with this D&I practitioner for a moment, and then I'll go on to answer the question. I think practitioners, in the 15 odd years I've been doing this, they enter the profession because they want to make a difference. There's good intent, make a positive impact on society. But sadly, most operate with too few resources, too small a budget, and their own job level sometimes is middle management, and which doesn't give it really the gravitas it deserves. And they endlessly work to create a better environment for everyone, and they're expected to influence, facilitate, hold tough conversations, and roll their sleeves up, offer strategic advice, and navigate unhealthy behaviours, because we come across those. And I think we're also at the forefront of really what's going on beneath the surface. So that, they are smart, they are resilient, and they push a really tough agenda. And do you know what? It's because leaders then can stand on a platform and state, D&I is at the heart of our business. So, they're doing what they can to actually protect and promote their organisation, the reputation, its leaders. And as I said in the book, my plea to leaders is set your practitioner free, empower them, and release their innovative ideas to be brave and bold. They're desperate to innovate and empower the organisation, and with the broad skill sets they have because of what they do. So just to your point, why do practitioners often underestimate the role? Well, I think it's because of the fact that they want to get into the role, and I think without maybe an initial understanding of the reactions they may find themselves at the end of, me included, and sometimes this can lead to personal suffering if they're not ready for it, or they underestimate, because they're bringing their own characteristics to the profession as well. And a bit of advice here, find a way to disconnect yourself. And it is harder than what I can say. So just finishing this question, on a personal note, some roles for me has been a lot tougher than others. Of course, I started out in middle management, and I've progressed my own career. And, I have had 2 chief diversity officer roles, reporting into CEOs. And what I have found about those really senior roles is that when you get a seat at the senior table, being included in the strategy and the decision making, and you're there as an advisor, it is actually a little bit different, a little bit easier.
Right.
So it's hard, but as you progress, it's like a roller coaster. You're going up and up and up to the top, and then sometimes you can come down.
Definitely lots of ups and downs. I think some of the people that are listening to this morning could definitely attest to that. I wanted to go back to something that you said, because as you started talking about the levels sometimes that people go in at, which I think is really interesting, and where you finished up with that conversation, you finished up with, obviously, and you've been in this profession for a long time, and so you are kind of like at that, at the exec level, at that table, and obviously you've got lots of experience and expertise. But as you say, a lot of people are coming to this, especially in some organizations, maybe not at that level, maybe at more like middle manager level. So they may well be like, say, 2 levels down, sometimes even from the CEO, but they might be, in theory, the most senior DI person in the organization, right? That's difficult, right? Just even that dynamic makes it more difficult. Would you agree?
I do agree, because people come to you because you might be an individual contributor, right? So you're the only one doing this, and you might be, 1 or 2 levels down from the chief people officer, or, head of talent, or wherever you sit. It is harder. And my advice is just to get sponsorship, get ears to listen to you. And whatever you do, get that sponsorship, so you're not the only one pushing on the doors.
Yeah, absolutely. Got a comment here from Safia. Safia, we'll get this one in before we move on to the next question, which is going to be about behavior change. Disconnecting from the work is definitely a work in progress. I don't think I took a conscious step into this work. I've always found myself at the center of honest, difficult conversation and inclusive change initiatives.
Yeah. This is a really, really lovely point, Sophia. And, my two CDO roles, yes, I had a seat at the table, but they were very, very hard gigs, because you were expected to answer all the questions. So to disconnect from that is almost impossible. But I gave myself a challenge, at the weekends, just don't think about it, consciously turn your brain off from it, because it will eat away at you, because we are all coming to this with different characteristics ourselves as well.
There's almost there's something about, and obviously part of the title of this is passion, and there's something about maybe the emotional toil of this, which actually we're going to get into in terms of some of the challenges around that, just because of the nature of the work. But something that I want to get into, which I know when we first connected, a couple of months ago, we were talking about your real deep sort of skill set and knowledge around behavioural change. And I was talking to somebody about this last week around the benefit of having some of those really deep and niche skills when you're coming to this work. So, for example, for me, it's transformation and change, because that was, kind of my expertise. And obviously, your expertise is around behavioural change. Why have you focused on behavioural change as a central part of your practice?
Yeah, and I think the pivot for me in my career was when I did my master's, MSc in behavioural change, and it was like a light bulb moment of, oh, do you know what? Put the B, behaviour, before the I, inclusion, before the D, diversity, BID. What I really learned through that process is that actually we need to start with our behaviours and our mindset. So we have to look at ourselves on how we behave before we can really understand how inclusive we're prepared to be, right? And then only then can we decide how we intend to embrace diversity as individuals. We do need to stop and look at how and why D&I is driven the way it is, not what do we need to do program after program after program. There is some underlying approaches that we need to really unfold. So, for example, organizations, they spend hundreds of thousands on, company behaviors, company values, but how are they really brought to life? If a company has a value of inclusion and respect, how is that brought to life? And how can you latch onto that and say, hey, if this is your value, how are you behaving around that value? How are you living and behaving every day behind that value? I'm also a big believer that this has to start at the top. You have to look at leadership behaviors, because you have an employee base looking up and seeing how these leaders are behaving, and they then choose to follow those or not. And I emphasize or not. So by getting underneath the skin of the behaviors of leaders, And we're not, don't over engineer this, right? Because we're talking about simply treating people with respect, kindness, fairness, and then that's how the culture plays out in an organization. So simply put, our behavior determines how inclusive we are, which in turn then determines on how we embrace diversity. And let's just bring it back again. So behaving inclusively is in how an individual behaves towards others by listening with curiosity, learning about their backgrounds and experiences, how they're included in the workplace, and also bringing that collective intelligence together, whether it's in a team or a group, where people feel more included. And so by including more of these ideas, commercially, it leads to innovation and creativity, because you're enabling greater diversity of ideas. There's the commercial point that is a good conversation to have with your leaders. I just want to talk a little bit about evidence here, and forgive me, I'm looking at my stats down here on a piece of paper, but there is, for the business case for inclusive leadership, 70% increase of individual feelings of inclusion when someone experiences feeling the respect and value and belonging. And as a result of that, team performance increases by 17%, and decision-making quality increases by 20%. There's the business case. There's that strong indication of the benefits of leading and behaving inclusively. And linking it to higher performance, business growth is key. You want to also look at your learning and development practices. And if your learning and development practice is excluding inclusive behavior training from their current leadership programs, then the organization is not fully producing the great leaders that we are now needing for now and the future. So do check your leadership development programs, make sure they have inclusive behavior modules in there. There's some brilliant modules that I studied, part of my MSc, they're in the book. And so, if they're not in there, you're not raising the awareness of inclusive leadership or behaviors. And therefore, it's harder to create that inclusive environment. Self-awareness, huge thing. Self-awareness for everybody, critical in leadership, since leaders must understand how their behaviors impact others. They have to know how my behavior impacts you. They have to know that. So by asking this question in a respectful way, how does your behavior impact others? If they don't know, their awareness is low, right? Because with the diversity of people in the workplace, it's just it makes business sense for leaders to come and be open to learn more about different cultures, so they can embrace this difference. So they cannot ignore it, because if they do, they're ignoring a proportion of their workforce, actually.
There's so many points that you covered here, and Safia's kind of actually delved into them. So I'm going to almost like work backwards through your points, Safia, because I think you've kind of like nailed some of them. At my work, we talk about inclusive leadership as a skill. And not just behaviours. Absolutely get that. Sharon and I discussed the importance. So we did a live a while ago. Sharon and I discussed the importance of intellectual humility, and I think for this work you also need cultural humility, which goes to your point about listening with curiosity. There's something about with the inclusive behaviours, and you talked about the how and the why. I guess I've got a question around, is there an element of that we're not, are we always, as DEI practitioners, do you think we sometimes struggle to articulate exactly what it is that leaders need to do? So, when we talk about something like inclusive behaviours, and I wonder, in your work, almost like how much detail you've had to go into this. Does it have to be in your experience working, say, for example, if you're working, say, one-on-one with a leader, does it almost have to be spelled out in terms of like, in this situation, this is what you need to do? Do you know what I mean? Because otherwise we sometimes throw these terms around, don't we? And even say, for example, there are models out there, like, for example, the 6C, Deloitte's 6 C's of inclusive leadership. But actually, I sometimes find leaders are still like, but what do I do on a day-to-day basis in every interaction? Do you know what I mean? What's your experience of almost like how much you've had to break it down to get that behavioural change?
100%. And I think Sophia is sort of going to this point as well. Sometimes people don't know how to listen with curiosity. We can break it down to just be curious. What does that mean? Just ask questions. What does that mean? What do you do at home? Getting it as close as you can to their everyday, and connect it with not just the head but with the heart as well. We know that expression, don't we? How do you get them to really understand this with the heart? If you have a daughter, do you want your daughter to be disrespected in the workplace and not get promotions and pay rises? No, I don't. That's not going to happen. Well, it does in your team. So bringing it down to a reality conversation, a real conversation. And one of my biggest, it was so impactful. One of my biggest points in my career, I was asked as a CDO by my CEO to do a men-only program. To take the top 250 men out of the organization and work with them on exactly this. Now, obviously, there was different cultural nuances, there was different behavior sets, and some were traditional and some weren't. But going through that program, which was, in my view at the time, was really different to what we usually know how to do this, right? Let's do a women in leadership program. We've got our ERGs, yay! But actually get to the dominant group, get to the decision makers. And within that program I set, and I designed it around the modules and some of the content of my master's. It was so profound because we did peel the onion so much that we were getting the point. We did experiential learning, and it sounds stupid right now, but it wasn't. Speak like a woman, greet like a woman, walk like a woman. And they were literally role playing, going, oh hello, and then we were showing how much space a man takes up to how a woman takes up. And it was just these light bulb moments. When you're on an aeroplane and you take both armrests. Exactly. And these, and they were getting it through this role play, experiential learning, and it was awkward, but we took them out the comfort zone.
Oh my gosh. When you said that, I literally thought, because I recently was on a flight and I was next to a man that literally was just taking up way too much space.
But it's getting them to, I do that, don't I? I do that.
And there's something about, you said that was the program, like for 250 men, but there is something about how do you even create a space that is either, sort of safe enough or where they feel comfortable to even do that kind of play, and actually in a way that there's learning from it, and it's not just almost like a bit of like, You're
so right, and we, the intention was to create that safe space, and we did, and I say that because we talked about male suicide, the mask that men have to wear, the pressures men are under. So there was no way we wanted to do this finger pointing. It was enabling an environment for them to come in and go, it's tough for us. This diversity stuff, I can't, it's too sensitive, it's too emotive. I've been shoved in a corner, I don't want to talk about it. So we were talking through how they can position themselves. And of course, this was in the days of the Me Too campaign. You know, a few years later, obviously BLM, Black Lives Matter. So we were dealing with big traumatic crises in the society around us, and just giving them the space to talk about it. You know, I had one male senior leader say to me, I don't even know how to greet a woman anymore, Vikki, you know. So to equip them and support them, rather than say, hey, you're excluded from the D&I agenda.
Or you're the problem, which is, you know, often what they hear, even if it's not what's being said, it's what they hear. You know, I think sometimes it's a narrative. There's a question here, which is an interesting one. It says, we talk sometimes about the need for empathy and inclusion. How do we include those who aren't naturally empathetic? So I guess, you know, linking on like the behavioural change, if you come across individuals who, and I'm not sure exactly what that looks like, but maybe it's around, you know, sort of like self-awareness, or, you know, they're struggling to put themselves in other shoes, etc. What does that look like?
It's a really good question, because there's lots of different language. You know, empathy is another way to equip and upskill leaders and talk through what does empathy mean. And you might be talking to a leader who just has never been empathic in their life, but somewhere they have been. At home, they have been somewhere. So by drawing out, you know, again, moving it from the head to the heart, drawing out, where have they shown empathy in their life, and how can you bring that into the workplace? And a little bit going back to this program, you know, wearing the mask is exhausting for men. And we talked about taking the mask off and showing, you know, skills, behaviors like empathy, and you can do it. If there's male leaders who are just like, no, forget it, you're not going to change them, move on.
And knowing that, you know, and you know, and being able to just be like, move on, you know, they're not gonna get on the bus, you know, as they say, is quite important, especially in terms of like for protecting your own, you know, sort of like emotional well-being and all of that. Safia, I can see that you've put a couple of points here, so let me just circle back. So we've got here, we often start the conversation around what a leader is responsible for and currently working in, and then ask questions around how might all your staff navigate that process. So I think, Safia, this is the point around how do we get the leaders to maybe move potentially even from head to heart in terms of, you know, thinking about how things impact others, to get their minds into a different space. And then also this point here, there are a lot of men I follow and know who are acutely aware of the dangers of isolation and masculinity myths, misogyny in the manosphere, and the need for active and pro-social men's spaces and friendships. And I think that's growing massively at the moment. We're in, I think, it almost like in a good way, an explosion of awareness. I've got somebody on next week who we're going to be delving into that. I've got somebody on here that is not, you know, the usual LinkedIn, is doing this work, is doing work with men, you know, out in the community, you know, isn't kind of in the corporate space. So that's, Safia will be doing more of that next week. I want to circle back to, and again, Safia did say something about switching off, which I think leads us nicely into our next question, which is, you know, we know that a lot of people in this space burn out, or step away, whether that's, you know, DI practitioners, or I often see it with employee network leads in particular, you know, because they've got like two jobs, right? They're trying to do their day job and this, you know, this, I don't want to call it a passion project because that sounds almost like a little bit disrespectful, but it can lead to burnout. So we've got a lot of people in this space burning out or stepping away. What do you feel is behind that, and what would help practitioners to actually stay and be able to thrive?
Yeah, you know, I've spoken to so many practitioners over the course of my career, and I can't speak highly enough of what we all do as a profession. And in my experience talking to them, there's many different reasons, right? I was talking to a very senior woman who had sort of 20 odd years, and she just said, I found myself just becoming quite cynical about the topic, and that didn't feel right. The topic just doesn't move on, and that's because we are working in change. So you could work so hard with your leaders, and then they move on, and then you got to start all over again. And of course, there's the one where I'm too invested and I came into the profession because I was passionate about it, but now it's a long uphill struggle. And there's quite a lot that I also observe as well as talk about, is this thing about being stuck in middle management where they're not empowered. They don't have access to the leaders or the data. And it's profoundly different when you are sitting at the table and you've got that advisory role, you've got that access to leaders and the data, versus sitting in sort of a role where you don't have access. And as I said at the very beginning, this is why I've attributed my book to the D&I practitioners out there, because I feel for them. I just feel for them. But also, you know, let's not forget we're at the forefront of this. We see it all. You know, we're at the edge of that cliff. We're not the follower, we're the leaders. So kudos to all of you doing this work. It also depends on the company you work for, right? I've worked for a number of different companies by choice, but choose that really carefully. Ask the right questions in the interview processes. You know, how serious are you? What does your board look like? Be sure about the company you go into. Is the company willing to listen to you? Is it a tick box? Yay, we've got a practitioner, tick the box. You know, are they going to put roadblocks in the way, or are they going to just shove you in a corner? I don't know. And so you do want to research them, and you want to, as I said, what is the profile of the leadership? What is the culture like? And of course, you don't have one culture. You have many subcultures in big organizations. Because I think culture is another example of mapping back to behaviors, right? There's a correlation there. You know, are you walking into a traditional mindset or a fast-paced mindset? This is something I really underestimated through my career decisions, not looking enough into, you know, the mindset. Is it a slow-paced traditional mindset, or is it just change? And, you know, excuse me, there's no right or wrong with that. But just know what you're walking into.
Something about some of the things that you were saying there in terms of like the types of organization and the culture, which really you know, it really resonates for me in terms of, you know, going in to deliver transformational change. I would often talk about right sizing the approach, because it needed to be different for different organizations, because as you say, some organizations were like 200 miles an hour. You know, maybe not even that much rigor around the decision. You know, they're just like, let's try it and see if it breaks, and then we'll tweak it and refine it as we go. Whereas other organizations, it's like, you know, they might literally take 6 months to make one very small decision, right, and move it forward. So I think, as a practitioner, you almost need to understand that. Otherwise, you are either going to butt up against this culture, or you're going to get incredibly frustrated at this different stuff. So something about the style, and making sure that either you are comfortable, you can flex sufficiently into that style, or finding a style that's going to fit for your style so that you don't get bent out of shape.
Absolutely. It's very, I'm just reflecting on my decisions on sort of different industry and sectors and how different it's been. And also you've got the cultural nuances on there, you know, the US headquarter to the Germany headquarter to the UK headquarter, whatever, you know, there is that sort of cultural nuance as well.
Absolutely. There is growing talk about professionalizing DEI, and that word, to be honest, I mean, that word is a little bit loaded. I know for some people the word professional is a little bit loaded for all sorts of reasons. That's maybe another LinkedIn in all of itself. But in your view, what would it look like, you know, whether or not we use the word professional, or just, you know, like maybe well, let's stick with that word. You know, growing talk about professionalizing DEI. In your view, what would that look like? And maybe what do we mean by it?
This is a real sticking point for me, because I know there's courses out there, and I'm sure they're great courses. I do think it's broadly unregulated. And that means you don't need a qualification to come in to the profession. And whilst there's more courses coming through, that's great. You know, again, coming back to how do you want to drive this? Why do you want to drive it, rather than what is on that course to then deliver? because that's going to shape the way you drive it, and we all choose different ways. And that's what I want to say is, how do you want to drive DE&I? I personally add other elements to the strategy. Commercial inclusion is a real great interest of mine. Social mobility is a real great interest of mine. So just those two, my strategy will look like, the inclusive practices that we all know, that we need to shove the organization into more inclusive environments. But then I'll have a social mobility strand to it, and I'll have the commercial inclusion. So let me give you an example. When I was in the fashion industry, I worked on inclusive design for fashion wear, bringing more diverse representation, bring more fashion designers into our portfolio. I specifically focused there on Black-owned brands. That our portfolio was very white, and we wanted to really showcase and bring to life the amazing Black-owned brands out there. Gender neutral apparel, accessible fashion for the disabled community, and this looks at the commercial value of D&I, which ultimately enhances the brand. Another example is when I was in the telco sector, and what I realized there through research and observations and a bit of mystery shopping myself, I brought in inclusive language into our customer service division. What I recognized is our young geeky techie staff, they were talking to the young geeky techie customer, which were mainly young men. Hey, how many gigabytes have you got? Yeah, it's great, isn't it? And using all this sort of jargon. But what that was doing was excluding women and the older population. And they weren't really connecting with that target segment, if you like. So by upskilling them in inclusive language, demystifying the techie language, sort of how many megapixels, how do you use your camera on your phone? That sort of language, just simplifying language. And what happened as a result of that is more customers were attracted to our product. We saw profits go up because they understood what they were buying much better, and they weren't frightened of the jargon that they were used to when they were going into the stores. And quite frankly, where does the disposable income sit? Older generation women. So, as a result of shifting the inclusion agenda to there, it was a commercial element, and we saw, we saw an ROI on it as well.
It's really interesting. I want to touch on a couple of the things that you said, but what I'm sort of hearing, and we talk about a couple of things. So first of all, when it comes to training, and I think we might have spoken about this when I talked to you, but I've looked at various different sort of like DEI courses and training and things like that, and certainly from the ones that I've seen, and maybe I haven't looked hard enough, but a lot of them seem to kind of just almost like be in the theory of D&I, if that makes sense. But there is something about, and I think the examples that you talked about there's something about once you understand the business case for your organization, and that's obviously there are elements to the business case, there is the moral case, but there is, as you say, there is the commercial case. And I often, with my accountant's hat on, when I go into organizations, and I often know what motivates certain leaders, and I often do lean quite heavily on the commercial. And then, as Safi has mentioned, there's also social impact as another strand, and the sweet spot, I guess, is when you can get it to do all things, right? But there's something about, as a practitioner, the better you can understand the business case, the more you can then turn it into the practical application. Because the examples that you gave there, for example, like in the fashion sector, in terms of, okay, I understand, that's the business case for this organization. What could that look like in practice? And then the inclusive language, bringing that in. I think as practitioners, sometimes it's kind of like, how do we bring the business case to life for this organization, which can look different for every organization, right?
It does, and it really depends on the organization you're working for and what your product is, what your service is. So get curious on what that looks like, and how as a D&I practitioner you can get involved in that side. I love Sophia's point here, social impact. I've just recently, in the last couple of years, I built an impact strategy, and I called it Impact Strategy, which the team partnered with NGOs. We did the commercial element there. And certainly with King, that was inclusive games design. How do we make our games more inclusive and more representative, more diverse representation, so we are, our players can really feel connected to us through that. So I love the social impact side. And yes, I've come from CSR, which I'll go into on your last question, but I love that side. And actually, on a personal level, I love bringing that in because I also love it.
And also, socially, but there's also definitely there is a link between the social impact and the commercial space, and that's almost like I did it in my post yesterday. I was talking about almost like finding that sweet spot, and I think if as practitioners, if we can bring that sort of almost like depth of understanding, especially if you've come into the DI role at a very senior level. At a strategic level, then I guess that's what we should be doing for the organisation. I have a mentee who is in a D&I role, and I was saying this to her actually a couple of weeks ago. She's in a new organisation, and she does have a seat at the board table. And I said, so that means you have got to be that strategic view in terms of for this organisation, how do you bring those strategic elements of the D&I to the business overall, because you are the most senior person. And I think sometimes D&I feel that sometimes we get stuck in the weeds. I think, the kind of the lower level stuff, as you say, the training initiatives, but actually there's the strategic bit about as a business, where we're moving forwards. Okay, final question. For network leaders in particular, so for ERG leaders or early stage practitioners, so maybe people that are slightly earlier in their career or individuals thinking about moving into DI, what key skills should we be looking at building, and what should we know maybe before making that leap into the world of D&I, this tough gig?
Yeah, well, one thing comes to mind: resilience. You need resilience, you really do. And of course, drive. Sometimes I feel it's a sales job, right? Knowing how to talk with conviction. But go where the energy is. If you have a sponsor if a leader is there saying, come and do that in my area, just go where the energy is, because there's going to be a lot of areas in the business where it is going to be pushing jelly up a hill, as I call it. So do go where the energy is and find ways to execute on really great things, because they then become your case studies, right? And where you can speak with even more conviction and then evidence as well. Build your own portfolio so you can talk about what you've executed and delivered for your company. And of course, data is key. So you want to be absolutely sure, what do I have access to? What resource do I have? What data do I have? What exec sponsorship what does that look like? And know how to talk to your leaders, because they love data. Everybody's into the data, but they like getting stuck in the data because they feel safe talking about the data. And that's where I challenge that, because the qual data, the comment, the verbatim, the feedback that you get in engagement surveys, this is just as important, because we're talking about employees' real life experiences at work. And when it comes to inclusion, I want to hear from them. I can count how many women are in the organization, but I want to hear from men and women and other areas, because I want to know what their real life experience is. And one big tool I use all the time is the employee engagement survey. That to me is a really good one. Go to the qual data, the quant and the numbers and the data is always there. Again, I think early stage practitioners, this might be hard, but really go in and negotiate your job level. You know, as the role should have a seat at some table, whether it's your CPO's table, whether it's your head of talent, whether it's, you know, higher and higher, get a seat somewhere so somebody is listening to your to you. And also partner with your centres of excellence. So that could be L&D, learning and development, talent, reward for gender pay gap, or whatever it is. Go in there and find the problems you are looking to solve. You have to find the problems you're looking to solve. I used to sit in every senior talent review. I was asked to do that. And that was really to support leaders with the fairness and the equitable, non-biased discussions they were having that led to decisions on promotions. That shifted the conversation. You know, we can't rely on leaders going into such critical conversations and not be biased, right?
So we're human.
Absolutely. You're an advisor. You're there to equip everyone. So, you know, take that advisory role. But before you make the leap, really understand why you want to move into the profession. And if it is just purely passion, just be a bit careful. And I think I'll just end this question on some personal sort of anecdotes here. So, you know, throughout my career, I've recognized a thread that really goes to the heart of a value I have, which is empowering others. I started out in sports. I reached out to underserved communities and I empowered them through sport. I moved my career into corporate social responsibility, CSR, as Safia alluded to earlier. That's investing in communities to empower them to have access to opportunities. Then I moved into D&I and I empowered businesses through the different ways I've talked about, which ultimately benefits employees. So I recognize my drive. I recognize why I do this work, but I also have recognized how to disconnect, you know, and that's, you know, because I know I'm values driven and I'm very clear about that. But throughout my career, I've been very exhausted. I've been on the end of discrimination. I've been very judged. And I've had conversations with leaders that have been super offensive. But I continue to run this course. And all of this is outweighed by the amazing support I've had from other leaders who have put trust in me and have enabled me to do my best work. The Men Only program was an absolute career change for me. So, you know, I'm going to continue to learn. I'm not going to give up on caring about this cause. And practitioners, they come in for a reason, and I've just shared my reason. It's not easy, but it is actually very rewarding when you can sit back and do that. And, you know, I entered many years ago this profession, and actually I think when I entered, I was actually very naive. I just thought everybody was kind to everyone else. But I had a fixed mindset, believing that there is no reason for treating people disrespectfully and unfairly. So actually, I'm quite grateful for the naivety of those earlier days.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I think that there's almost like that, as you call it, naivety is I think what, if it wasn't for that, probably a lot of people wouldn't even go into this work, right? So we have to be almost like grateful for the naive optimism. You know, even I sometimes refer to myself as a Pollyanna. That's ever the optimist, right? So I completely get that. I loved what you said, Vikki, about you said go where the energy is. Oh, honestly, just that phrase in itself, I think is so important, because especially, you know, and you were talking about resilience, and sometimes you need that positive energy and that support to build your resilience back up, right? So when you're getting the knocks from the individuals that, you know, that just won't get on the bus or are complete terrorists or saboteurs or whatever, you need your supporters and your allies. And, you know, as I sometimes talk about, you know, people that are going to speak up for you when you're not in the room, you know, especially if you're the only person doing this work. It's really important. So honestly, Vikki, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you today. So much, you know, so many really practical insights and lessons. So I'd highly encourage people, if if you are in this work, to check out Vikki's book. Definitely. And yeah, we're going to leave you, we'll maybe leave you with just sort of like one tip, especially if you're doing this work and you're maybe feeling a little bit burned out and stressed. Safia, I know there was one question that you mentioned that I don't think we came back to, which was about switching off somewhere, personal separation through switching off and internal boundaries. The one tip that I would leave you, and then I'm going to give Vikki the last word, is around, so I mentioned that I have a mentee who is in this work, and I would, if you don't have somebody like that, a mentor or a peer within the profession that you can bounce things off, I would highly recommend that. There's some really good roundtables that are now being set up for people in this work, which I think is great for kind of like lifting the standards in the profession, but also just that kind of the sort of emotional support for each other. So I would sort of say, if you don't have that, and you're doing this work, please do find that wherever you can, whether it's a peer, whether it's a LinkedIn friend that you make and you kind of set time aside to have a virtual or real coffee. That will really help, I think, in terms of your resilience. I don't know what advice you would leave people with, Vikki, just as maybe the one thing to keep people going, to keep people fighting.
The one thing, do you know what? Just zoom out every now and then and realize you are doing really good work. You're on the edge, you're seeing it all, but well done you for being on the edge. Just zoom out and just give yourself a pat on the back.
Absolutely. I love that. Zoom out, go where the energy is and then zoom out. Perfect. Amazing. Vikki, thank you so much for this incredible conversation, and thank you to everybody that's been with us live. Safi in particular for your insights. I feel like you've literally been with us almost like every sentence, every beat. And for anybody that is watching this on the replay, thank you so much for taking some time out for your day. I hope you found it incredibly useful. You can find Vikki Leach, Vikki Leach, here on LinkedIn. Are you on any other platforms, Vikki, or is this where you live?
Just
online?
LinkedIn,
just LinkedIn. Yeah, very sensible choice. Just a bit like me, apart from YouTube. It's the safe platform. Okay, perfect. Vikki, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you so much.